Welcome, everyone, to CIFAR's series of virtual talks on the theme Science as the Exit Strategy. These talks are intended to share how research from across the academy, from computer science, population and public health, to economics and anthropology, form the basis for evidence-informed decision-making as governments begin planning how best to reopen shuttered societies and economies in the wake of COVID-19. If you're not familiar with us, CIFAR is a Canadian-based global charitable organization that convenes extraordinary minds to address some of science and humanity's most important and pressing questions. Like many other organizations across the globe, CIFAR has pivoted quickly to take action on COVID-19, launching new projects and initiatives, some of which we are highlighting through this webinar series. My name is Kate Geddie. I am Senior Director of Research at CIFAR, and it's my true pleasure to introduce you today to Professor Hendrik Poinar. Hendrik is Professor of Anthropology at McMaster University, where he draws on his training in molecular evolutionary genetics and biological anthropology to address questions about past pandemics. In particular, he uses chemical and molecular techniques within forensic, archaeological, and paleontological remains to ask questions such as which pathogens are responsible for past pandemics. He's also a fellow in CIFAR's Humans and the Microbiome program, and he'll be sharing with us today how knowledge of past pandemics can inform our understanding of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, Hendrik, to start off our conversation, I'd like to ask you about the broad themes that emerge in art depicting past epidemics. So, for example, looking at this painting by Antoine Jean Gros, hopefully it'll be coming up, that centers on Napoleon. What role does historical art play in how we view and think about pandemics?
Well, so first, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure and honor to be part of this talking point today, and welcome to everybody who's listening. This is a great painting. Art has always been a powerful way for people to reflect and comment on pandemics socially, politically, and individually. It's a perfect tool, art, to illustrate both human and political responses to pandemics in the past, and probably not surprisingly to most of you, is tremendously relevant today. There's lots of important points, and we could talk about this painting for hours and hours, but I'll try to minimize those to a few of the important points. So first, if we put it into context, this is painted by Antoine Jean Gros in 1804. And it's titled Napoleon Bonaparte Visiting the Plague-Stricken in Jaffa. And this was part of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign to fight the Ottomans as he moved across Egypt and in Syria. And this takes place basically after the brutal siege of Jaffa in 1799. And shortly thereafter, there was an outbreak of bubonic plague. And most of you will know, of course, that plagues and war go hand in hand. And so if we think about plague, sort of bubonic plague, an 18th century plague epidemic, this is one of the last ones recorded in the Middle East and Europe. This is a descendant, this epidemic, of the famous Black Death, which happened in 1346 and spread across Europe, killing about 50 million people. But I think importantly, that number seems out of context unless you place it into the overall mortality rate, which is something between 30 and 40% of the total population, which is, we think about the numbers today with COVID, and they are dramatic nonetheless. But I think in terms of the context of the total population, it was a tremendous wipe, of course, to the Europeans. So here Napoleon is visiting his plague-stricken soldiers, and he sits. I think what's interesting is that there's really two important points that I want to illustrate in this painting. One, of course, is he sits dead center of this painting. Of course, we'll talk about the meaning of that in a second. The light's hitting him from the top, and of course, it's drawn at the time and in an Oriental framework, which was a very important part of European life. There's sort of the mystery of the Orient at that time. So I think the most important narrative that it draws upon is this idea of us versus them. And this is a typical narrative of epidemics. We always think about people, those that are sick and those that are healthy. But this case, of course, there's a double entendre, because those that are sick, and you can see at the center of the painting Napoleon touching a sick soldier, actually touching a bubo of the sick soldier. These soldiers are supposed to be his French soldiers, but they look very similar to the soldiers at the very front of the painting in the dark sort of shadows, which are also Arab soldiers that are dying, Ottoman soldiers that are dying from the plague as well. And I think here you have the balance of the sick versus the healthy, but you also have this narrative of the disease came from afar, came from away. And it describes this idea of what we call European exceptionalism, that the Europeans could never themselves harbor disease. It was always diseases coming from the East. And it's probably strange, or maybe not, that we still have that narrative playing out today, right? COVID is a Chinese disease or a Chinese virus. And that's no different than what we saw here. In fact, our work actually on the DNA of plague victims throughout Europe, throughout the second pandemic, show that actually that's not at all true. Plague actually maintained itself in local reservoirs and kept emerging. So plague was a very European disease, even though the Europeans like to think of themselves as being exceptional, right? And so in this case, the disease is coming from the East. It's coming from people that don't know how to care for themselves and take care for themselves, and so on and so forth. And so I think that's one of the important narratives, us versus them. The second thing that I think is probably extremely relevant today is that, remember that this is a propaganda piece. This was commissioned by Napoleon in 1804 to be a piece that would allow him to rise to as emperor, right? He wasn't emperor at this point, but he was hoping that this piece would sort of help illuminate several of his important points. And, you know, Napoleon sits dead center. We have the light basically from the heavens highlighting Napoleon. And he's doing what we know from the Bible, of course, Christ did with lepers, or the king during medieval times would do with sick people, which is basically laying the hands upon the sick and the attempts to heal them. So, but it's also to illustrate to the people in France that Napoleon was tremendously brave, that he would unglove himself. I mean, how important are gloves in the current pandemic when we think about, but he's taking off his glove and he's actually touching the bubo. And if we can just zoom in on that illustration in the next image, you can see that not only is he touching that, but look at his officers and his doctors who are both behind him, right? They're horrified, which is the true representation of you know, as the painter knew, people were scared out of their minds about plague, because plague had repeatedly erupted in Europe for 400 years, killing, you know, millions and millions of people. And so this doctor behind him is not surprisingly donning a mask. And of course, that's a narrative theme that we have repeatedly introduced today, and actually, unfortunately, back and forth, right? It should have been wearing masks from the beginning. And of course, we've got conflicting messages about how useful those would be. And so the doctor behind him is saying, hey, Napoleon, you're nuts. This is crazy. But of course, as part of the propaganda piece, it gives legitimacy, of course, to the power and to his, you know, domineering role, that he has this heavenly godlike power, that he can touch the sick, hopefully heal them, and therefore maintaining level above the common people, right? So this power illustrated in this illustration is really a legitimacy to continue ruling.
That's really interesting, and that, as you've alluded to in your response there, some of our current practices in response to COVID-19 also are not new. I mean, you've talked about the wearing of the mask, but also maybe if we go to another image that we have here from the 1918 flu, we can see that the sick are often isolated from the healthy, just as we're attempting to quarantine those sick with the coronavirus. So, I mean, what do our responses tell us about the relationship between, on the one hand, scientific understandings and social practices, such as stigmatization on the other?
Yeah, there were two very important points. Yeah, I mean, this is Camp Funston, Kansas, with the American soldiers that are sick of influenza. And of course, the scientific reason for quarantine, of course, is to stem or quell the spread of infection. And this, of course, comes from, actually, the earliest known quarantine examples come from the city of Ragusa, which, of course, is modern-day Dubrovnik, and the Venetians closely thereafter took it as quarantine, 40 days of keeping a ship on these small islands off the coast of Venice in the hopes of quelling the disease. But of course, you think about that 40 days on a ship. I mean, every time I think about quaranta, I think about the poor people on the cruise ships, thinking how uncomfortable this is. I mean, so the scientific reason, of course, is the hope to keep the disease at bay. But of course, there's political and social motivation for doing this. So this is the 1918 influenza epidemic. And no government at the time wanted to acknowledge its presence, right, on their soil. In fact, all Western journalists in Europe and in North America were banned and fined and threatened with prison time if they reported on it. And there's only one country that actually reported freely on it, and of course that was Spain, hence the name Spanish flu. And so this just illustrates again that the quarantine serves a political purpose, which is to make the sick not visible to the rest of us. And so quarantine actually, we try to frame, governments will try to frame quarantine as being an important part to protect everybody and to help those that are sick. But of course it never is. It's never for those who need it the most, which are the sick. It's always a way to protect the population from those that are sick, right? And so maybe another way to look at that is the next illustration, which is, this is the TB patients in a sanatorium. And of course, many of you probably know sanatorium just in your backyards. I mean, there's one here in Hamilton, and there's several across Toronto and upstate New York. And these were TB patients. And they were sent to sanatorium, not out of what I like to call the Thomas Mann sort of romantic alpine vision of, oh, it's going to be a beautiful day looking at these Edelweiss in the Swiss Alps, but rather this was a fear of the general public. And what did it cause? It actually caused social death, because you were completely isolated from your family, you were isolated from your community, you were isolated from any culture that you had, and you were sent there basically to die. And so, again, quarantine served both political and social interests, but really they never end up serving those who need it the most, which are usually the sick.
Wow, that's quite a striking comment to end on there. Well, maybe then I'll transition to a question that's in quite a different vein, which is the CIFAR group that you're a part of, the Humans in the Microbiome program, is interested in how the microbes that live in and on us affect our health and development. We're often commenting today on the negative impact that our overly or hyper hygienic approaches are having on our microbial diversity. What role has hygiene played in past pandemics?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question, given the group that I'm a part of and fortunate to be a part of, Human in the Microbiome. I mean, hygiene, if we look at the next image, hygiene has a much longer history than most of us appreciate, right? The earliest accounts, and these are actually written accounts, of course, are the 7th century Greek goddess Hygeia. It was also later a Roman goddess as well, of sanitation, cleanliness, and health. And so this is quite old. Our appreciation of cleanliness is next to godliness, right? And for the Romans, as shown here in the illustration below, it was all about controlling water. Water was personal hygiene, so think about the Roman baths, for instance. But it was also about removal of fetid water and sewage and so on and so forth. So some of the earliest sewers, of course, were Romans. They were exposed at some of the time, but still, the idea was to get rid of waste. And I find that really interesting, because most of our sense of when we think about the Middle Ages and hygiene, we think of the Monty Python's Holy Grail, right? There's a guy dragging a cart with dead bodies through the town, and there's nothing but feces everywhere, and it's dark and grim and muddy, and that's always our perpetuated image of that. But we have evidence actually suggesting it really wasn't like that in all situations. Yes, in impoverished parts of the city it might have been. In most cases it really wasn't. People took much more care. So I'd like say we've probably had this disconnect with our world since the rise of cities, and hygiene has probably played a role in that diminution of that microbiome over a long time. But really today, there's been an acceleration in that destruction of our microbial constituents in a hyper-hygienic or overly sanitized world. And that comes mostly because of our fear of microbes, right? I mean, all I have to do is throw up some images of what plague was like in the Middle Ages, and you talk about people, 30% of the population dying. Makes good sense that people were, really, really scared about microbes, right? Microbes became the sort of the evil and feared thing. Certainly when germ theory came about, we started identifying or linking particular bacteria with known infectious diseases. And so I think, because of this hyper-sanitization that we go through now with, Purell, I mean, think about how important Purell is currently, right? And we've also, at the same time, we've sort of diminished our microbial constituents, which are our first line of defense, both orally and in the gut, as a way to defend ourselves against infection. So I think, it's importantly, as people in the group, the human and the micro group have pointed out, there's a pendulum that swings back and forth. And in the times of active infectious disease and pandemics, hygiene is exceptionally important. Washing your hands, making sure that if you come into contact with somebody, you wash your clothes, you try to wear a mask, you try to clean it, things that enter your house. So that's an exceptionally important point now. But the problem is how will we behave when the pandemic's over, right? The behaviors during the Black Death, they continued for a long time thereafter. People had a hard time switching back because certainly in the case of Black Death, you had these repeated epidemics. So you were never really without infectious disease. So will we maintain this hyper sterilization that we're going through now and increase it actually morefold because of this epidemic? Or will we switch back to sort of a more healthier way, which is a return to nature rather than a continued removal from nature? As our fearless leader, Brett Finlay, would say, let them eat dirt, right? Return to the earth so that we can use those microbes as a way to stimulate our immune system in the event that would actually better protect us from the next coming pandemic.
That's interesting. Another question I have, and I'm thinking about this also just looking at the backdrop that you have there, the sort of the danse macabre behind you. As you certainly know, as a scholar of pandemics, it can often be quite a dark topic. But I'm wondering if it's possible to also talk about how responses to certain epidemics have shown something inspiring about humanity.
Yeah, I think it's always important. I mean, pandemics have a tendency to bring out the worst, but and also importantly bring out the best. I mean, I think there's a balance that comes to the fear and loss in the sense of community. And it can strengthen relationships between people. It can strengthen community relationships. It can strengthen your love for particular individuals. During the Black Death, one of the famous engravings is death carrying off children, because there's such a high mortality rate of infants and children. And so thereafter, children became much more important. Not that they weren't before, but there was much more of a sense of preciousness with children after the Black Death took so many of them away. And I think today about frontline workers. I also think about our elders who we've again quarantined in essence in a way. And I think of them in terms of like the sanatorium movement, and how will elders be more precious in the years to come, because they're now isolated. We can't actually have direct contact with them. My parents are both elderly, not yet in homes, but are being isolated themselves, and we can't see or speak and talk to them on a one-on-one basis out of complete fear. And so I think it's going to change our behavior and our perspective on that. I think, importantly, I'm reminded every day of the banging of the pots at 7:00 for the frontline workers in the ER and all those important things. I'm thinking about the Italians singing on their balconies. And so I think, even though these are dark times, and they certainly past epidemics have brought exceptionally dark times, I think there's a tremendous balance that comes with some of the beauty that comes out of individuals making tremendous signs of appreciation and love that's what can help us carry us through these challenging times.
Well, thank you so much, Hendrik, for sharing your insights with us. Perhaps now I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have come in from our audience. So one that's come in is, why do so many diseases leading to pandemics seem to come from animals?
Yeah, well, I mean, most of the diseases, infectious diseases, well, about 60 to 70% of them are zoonotic in origin. That is, they jump from animal reservoirs into humans. In the case of plague, of course, these were rodents. Rodents are known to harbor Yersinia pestis, and they jump, unfortunately, by spillover events that come from rodent infections or rodent epidemics that then spill into humans. And these are just, unfortunately, accidental emergences that happen when humans come into close proximity, right? So you think about humans in the medieval ages, and the populations are growing, and all of a sudden you have an expansion into a more natural land. Maybe you're farming that land, and so now you come into contact with these rodents that then harbor these pathogens, which are in some cases not infectious to the rodent themselves, and so then they spill accidentally into humans. And we know that that's the same case, of course, with COVID. These are bat origin, most likely, but it seems like they can infect a wide host of other mammalian animals. So there's talk, of course, of the pangolin. So there seems to be a really interesting evolutionary link between the pangolin and the bat. And now they're talking about, of course, ferrets and other felines and so on and so forth. So a large percentage of these infectious agents are still out there. In fact, I mean, I think the latest estimates are about 2% of the known viriome has actually been sequenced. So there's a lot of viruses, RNA viruses out there that are sitting in hosts. And of course, as we continue to encroach on these landscapes, we're going to run into these spillover events repeatedly.
Another question that kind of picks up on that point that's come in is, how then do we convince people that not all microbes are bad?
Well, I think the group that I'm lucky to be a part of is one way to do that. I mean, we have to educate the young, and I see it happening all the time. We talk about the important bacteria in yogurt and the important bacteria in cheese and milk, and how eating healthy vegetables can add, important fiber to your gut, and your gut contains all these microbes. And so I think we need to, we've really talked about individual bacteria over the course of history that have had massive effects on mortality rates, but we need to talk in the same way about all these great bacteria, the lactobacilli, for example, that are important bacteria from milk or dairy-based products that play a tremendous role in providing important neurotransmitters and communicate back and forth with our brains, and can modulate depression and anxiety, and in some cases even obesity. So there's a tremendous, I think that the more we sort of open up this fantastic microbial box that is our system, our holobiont as it's placed, that we are not just human cells, we're sort of more bacterial and viral and fungal cells than we are human, which is an interesting way to think about it. And as that becomes increasingly more and better known, I think people really appreciate there's a fine balance between those that are really problematic, which it's really a handful. It's a very small number of infectious agents so far that have really caused the kind of epidemics that I sort of study in the past. The bulk of them do very little to us, if anything at all, and a huge host of them that we live with are symbionts, helpful commensals that help us digest foods and fight infection and so on and so forth.
That's terrific. I'm sort of almost distracted by all these questions. I think this conversation could go on for quite a long time. I'm having to choose amongst terrific questions here, but maybe I'll ask one of the ones that just came in. But it's the question is that it seems that with most plagues, there are great inequalities in how they affect different groups and populations in society. Can you think of examples where societies have handled these diseases more equitably?
Oh, that's a very good question. Epidemics and pandemics are an immediate window onto the state of affairs of any particular country, county, nation, however you want to divide it. I mean, and they immediately bring to the surface the inequity that exists within societies. So So your question was, can I think of a case where they dealt more equitably? That's a really, really good question. Off the top of my head, unfortunately, no. I mean, the one thing epidemics do is they immediately highlight government failures, right? And so in any case where you have dramatic inequality of wealth, for example, pandemics always affect those of lower socioeconomic income much harder than they do the other ones, those that aren't in those situations, because they don't have access to proper food and nutrition, and so they're immunocompromised. They don't have access to clean water. We know that's a big problem today across even our country, right, with indigenous populations in the north. They don't have access to proper healthcare and medicines. So this is a question I'll take with me after this to really think hard about, because it certainly doesn't come to mind immediately. Most of the cases that I can think about in the past always shows dramatic inequity across populations, unfortunately, sadly. It's still true today, even in the current epidemic, again, highlighting all these social issues once again.
Thank you for that response. Unfortunately, we've only got about 2 minutes left, so I might try to squeeze in one last question if you're interested, and it relates more to your own research, which involves recovering DNA from centuries ago. And someone is asking, what does ancient DNA tell us about ancient pathogens and pandemics?
Yeah, that's very good questions. Well, so I think one of the important things one of the first thing I think is really important is that can help really identify the etiology of a particular infectious epidemic. And that might seem like, well, that's sort of an easy answer. But you have to understand that in the absence, in a vacuum of an identifiable agent, blame can go in all sorts of different directions. So remember, during the Black Death, during that absence of knowledge of what that was, people, of course, blamed everybody you can imagine under the sun. So prostitutes, Jews, everybody was either burned at the stake or tortured in various ways that we don't even want to get into or talk about. And that's still, you would think, oh, well, Hendrik, that's something of the past. Well, no, think about HIV, right? For the longest time, the HIV wasn't even associated as being a potential virus. And because it happened to be in a disenfranchised community, in the homosexual community in San Francisco and New York and Montreal, it was really stigmatized as sort of unimportant and insignificant. And when that identity became aware, it was really significant. So I think one of the things is really that immediate identity of what those infectious agents were in the past. The second thing, of course, is, do we understand if its behavior in the past is different to how it might act still today, or if reemergences continue to happen, how can we actually modulate our behavior differently depending upon that? Are there things that we can do to actually contact and trace and be aware, screen, for example, if we know the evolutionary history of that. The third thing, of course, is it talks about an evolutionary descendant ratio between the ancient infectious agents and the contemporary ones. And I think that plays also an important role in understanding its evolutionary trajectory. Where is it going from here? Where has it been? I think we're running out of time, so I could go on and on about this topic.
I'm sure you could. That's been really, really fantastic, Hendrik. Thank you so much. And I'd also really like to thank everyone for joining in and giving us such terrific questions to feed you. So for everyone, please visit our website, CIFAR.ca, to find out more about the series. We'll have a few more talks coming up, and we also have previous recorded talks available there. But yes, just in signing off, I'd like to thank you again, Hendrik, and wish you all a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.